The lake had gone quiet again, too quiet. The hole in the ice was no bigger than a dinner plate, but below it, the darkness moved. Daniel dropped to his knees, fists hammering the frozen surface. "Emily." No answer, only bubbles rising, then nothing. Shadow skidded beside him, paws scraping the ice, barking wildly into the cold silence. When Daniel stopped calling, Shadow didn't. He lay down beside the crack and stared into the black, refusing to move even as the frost formed on his fur. The wind had been steady all afternoon, sweeping snow across Miller's Lake until the entire surface looked like a single sheet of white glass. Daniel had warned the neighborhood kids to stay close to the shoreline. The ice was thick but deceptive. Beneath the outer layer, a current ran strong. Emily never listened long when laughter was louder than warnings. She darted ahead with her red scarf trailing behind her, her boots tapping a rhythm that echoed across the lake like distant drums. Shadow padded after her, ears twitching, tongue lolling in the cold air. Daniel turned for half a second, to adjust his gloves, to scan the horizon, and that was all it took. A crack split the silence. He spun. The sound came again, sharp, metallic, spreading. His eyes found her just as the ice fractured under her boots. Emily's scream pierced the wind as she plunged through, vanishing in a splash of black water. The hole closed almost instantly, swallowing the red of her scarf. "Emily!" Daniel's voice thundered across the lake. He sprinted forward, boots slipping on the slick surface, heart hammering so hard he could hear it over the wind. The hole was small, jagged around the edges, water already freezing back into slush. He dropped to his knees, plunging his gloved hands into the icy blackness. The cold hit like knives, stealing breath and thought. He reached, felt nothing but swirling void. "Emily!" Shadow barked furiously beside him, paws scraping the ice. The shepherd's body trembled, not with fear, but urgency. When Daniel pulled his arms back, Shadow shoved forward, nose to the hole, barking louder. "Shadow, no!" Daniel shouted, but the dog didn't move away. Instead, he lowered himself flat against the ice, staring into the hole as if sheer will could bring her back. His chest heaved, his breath forming frost on the glassy surface. Daniel slammed his fists against the ice, cracking it again. "Come on, Emily, answer me." Nothing. Wind howled. The snow thickened. The world shrank to that single dark circle and the echo of a dog's relentless bark. Minutes passed, maybe more. Daniel's hands were numb, bloodless. He pressed his ear to the ice, desperate for any sound beneath, the faintest splash, the softest voice. Nothing but silence. Then, faintly, just once, a thud. A muffled tap from below. Daniel froze. "She's alive!" He shouted into the wind. "Emily's under, she's under here." Shadow erupted, barking louder than ever, claws tearing at the ice, refusing to move from that spot. Daniel grabbed the radio at his belt, voice shaking as he called for help. "Child under ice, send rescue. South end of Miller's Lake. She's still alive." His eyes burned. His heart refused to slow. Shadow stayed glued to the crack, head low, nose pressed against the cold, breath fogging over the hole like a shield of warmth. As the wind howled across the lake, the shepherd began to whine, a sound Daniel had never heard from him before. Not fear. Not pain. Something else. Desperation. He lay down beside Shadow, shoulder to shoulder on the ice, staring into the dark water where Emily had vanished. "Hold on, kiddo," he whispered. "We're not leaving you." And Shadow, the soldier's dog, never blinked. The rescue call went out within minutes, but for Daniel, every second stretched into eternity. The storm had dulled to a light snowfall now, the lake a vast, white expanse of stillness. But beneath that stillness, a child was trapped. "Team's on the way," a voice crackled through his radio. "Hold your position and mark the location." "Mark it?" He didn't need to. Shadow was the mark. The shepherd refused to move from the crack where Emily had gone under. He stood rigid at first, barking sharply into the hole, then lowered himself again, nose pressed to the ice. Steam curled from his muzzle in thick bursts, his breath frosting the edge of the crack until tiny icicles formed. Every time Daniel tried to pull him back, Shadow growled low, not at Daniel, but at the idea of leaving. Daniel knelt beside him, his own breath shaking. "She's under there, boy." "I know. We'll get her." He scanned the lake, searching for any sign of movement beneath the ice. Nothing. Only shifting shadows, currents playing tricks with the mind. The cold was merciless, biting through layers of fabric and into his bones. His gloves were soaked, fingers stiff and bleeding. Shadow whimpered softly and pawed at the hole, ears pinned flat. His body trembled, but his eyes were locked on the dark water. It wasn't random, he was listening, sensing something Daniel couldn't. Daniel leaned closer, pressing his ear against the ice once more. Faintly, very faintly, a dull thump echoed back. 2, then 3. A rhythm. It wasn't the lake, it was deliberate. "She's still moving," he whispered. Then louder, "She's still alive." Shadow barked once, short and sharp, as if to confirm it. Daniel's heart kicked into overdrive. He scanned the frozen surface for weak points, thin spots where the rescue divers could break through. The problem was distance. Even if Emily had been dragged by the current, only Shadow could pinpoint her exact spot now. The dog suddenly rose, turned in a slow circle, nose sweeping along the surface. Then he stopped about 6 feet from the hole and began barking again, claws scratching at the ice. Daniel followed, crawling on his knees, the surface groaning beneath his weight. "You think she's moved?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Shadow was tracking her by something deeper, scent, vibration, instinct. He dropped flat and pressed his face to the ice. Beneath, he could barely make out shapes moving, blurred, distorted, but moving. Emily's coat, perhaps, or her scarf. The sight froze his blood. "Hold on, Emily. Hold on," he shouted, slamming his fist against the ice. In the distance, sirens wailed. Flashing red lights danced faintly across the white field as rescue trucks approached. Daniel waved his free arm frantically, shouting through the radio, "Over here. South end. Dogs marking her position." Shadow didn't stop barking. Even when rescue boots thundered onto the ice, even when floodlights bathed the lake in harsh yellow light, he kept his focus on that single patch of frozen surface. A diver dropped to his knees beside Daniel, setting down gear. "She's under here?" Daniel nodded breathlessly. He tracked her. 6 feet from the crack. The diver looked at the dog skeptically but didn't argue. "Then we trust the dog." He began drilling into the ice, blades shrieking as they cut through. Steam and ice chips filled the air. Shadow barked furiously at every vibration, pacing in tight circles, unable to look away. Minutes later, a new hole gaped open. The diver plunged his gloved hand in, feeling the current, then nodded sharply. "We've got movement." "She's trapped in the current, still warm enough to have circulation." Daniel's heart leapt. "Go!" The diver vanished into the water, tethered by a line. Seconds turned to minutes again. Shadow whined, pacing, ears flicking toward the hole, every muscle quivering. Then, bubbles. The rope jerked. A muffled shout echoed from below. "Got her! Pull!" Hands grabbed the line, hauling hard. The diver broke the surface, dragging Emily with him. Her body was limp, her coat darkened by the icy water, her face pale. But her chest moved, faintly. Daniel lunged forward, gathering her into his arms as medics rushed in. Shadow leapt beside them, licking her face, whining desperately. "She's breathing," one medic shouted. "Weak pulse, get her inside," Now. Daniel didn't look up. His arms tightened around her as if he could squeeze warmth back into her body. You're safe now, kiddo. You hear me? You're safe. Shadow pressed his nose against her cheek, as if confirming it himself. The ice beneath them moaned once more, but this time Daniel didn't flinch. The danger wasn't below anymore, it was behind. Ahead lay warmth, lights, and the thin, flickering line between life and loss. And a dog who refused to let the line break. The world became noise, boots slamming, radios crackling, men shouting commands through the cold. Floodlights turned the lake into a stage of chaos. Steam rose from the new hole, mixing with snow and breath and fear. Daniel ran beside the stretcher as medics hauled Emily toward the firehouse. Her limp body lay cocooned in blankets, water dripping from her sleeves, lips pale and parted. A medic pressed an oxygen mask to her face, his voice clipped and urgent. No pulse yet, starting compressions. Shadow sprinted alongside, paws slipping on the ice, barking wildly. The sound cut through the wind, raw and terrified. He tried to leap onto the stretcher twice until Daniel grabbed his harness, pulling him close. Easy, boy. She's breathing. Let them work. The shepherd struggled against his grip, chest heaving, eyes locked on Emily. It wasn't just instinct, it was heartbreak. Daniel could feel the tension in the leash like electricity, the dog's desperate refusal to accept what had almost happened. Inside the firehouse, warmth hit like a wave. Heaters roared, steam billowed, voices overlapped. The smell of melting snow, sweat, and diesel filled the air. Daniel stumbled through the door with Shadow pressed to his side as medics surrounded Emily's cot. Get those wet clothes off, now, one barked. Blankets. Hot packs. Push the heat. They stripped the soaked layers, wrapping her small frame in thermal sheets. Another medic counted compressions aloud, steady, relentless. A third monitored vitals. The machine stayed silent at first, the only sounds the thump of gloved hands and Shadow's soft, broken whine. Daniel stood frozen, every instinct screaming to move, to help, but he couldn't do a damn thing except watch. Come on, Emily, he whispered, voice cracking. You're tougher than this. Come on. Shadow let out a low, trembling sound, half growl, half moan, and pressed his muzzle to the edge of the cot. His breath fogged the air, forming tiny clouds that vanished instantly. His eyes darted between Emily and Daniel as if demanding, do something. The medic holding the defibrillator shouted, clear. The shock jolted through Emily's small body. Nothing. Again. Another jolt. Then. A cough. A faint, wet gasp. The room froze. Daniel's heart leapt to his throat. The medic leaned closer, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. We've got a pulse. Weak but steady. Daniel sagged against the wall, breath catching like he'd been underwater himself. That's it, kiddo, that's it. Shadow barked once, sharp, triumphant, then climbed onto the edge of the cot, ignoring the startled medics. He curled himself along Emily's side, pressing warmth into her chilled body. The child's trembling hand lifted slowly, weakly tangling in his fur. Daniel wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. You're a damn hero, Shadow. The head medic looked up briefly. That dog of yours, he found her, didn't he? Daniel nodded, voice hoarse. He never left the crack. Then we owe him one, the medic said, returning to his work. Because without him, she'd still be under the ice. Minutes passed in fragile relief. Emily's breathing steadied beneath the oxygen mask. Her eyelids fluttered, a tiny moan escaping as color crept back into her cheeks. Shadow lowered his head beside hers, his chest rising in rhythm with hers as though syncing their hearts. Daniel crouched beside them both, one hand on the dog's back, the other brushing Emily's damp hair aside. The heat from the heater hit his frozen skin, stinging like needles, but he didn't move. Outside, the storm had quieted to a whisper. Through the frosted window, the sun tried to pierce the clouds, a faint promise of dawn. Daniel finally exhaled, every muscle unclenching. The sound was half relief, half surrender. You did it, Shadow. You didn't just find her. You refused to give up. The shepherd didn't move. His only answer was another sigh, heavy, tired, and full of peace. The firehouse never truly went silent, but after the chaos of rescue, the noise softened into something gentler, heaters humming, boots scuffing on concrete, medics speaking in low, careful tones. Outside, wind scraped at the doors like tired claws, the storm's rage spent. Emily lay wrapped in layers of blankets near the biggest heater, her face pale but peaceful now. The oxygen mask fogged in slow, steady pulses. Each time it cleared, Daniel counted her breaths. He had been counting for hours. Shadow hadn't moved once. The shepherd was curled tight against the cot, his flank pressed to the girl's hip, his head resting near her shoulder. Steam rose faintly from his drying fur. Someone had tried to coax him away earlier. He needs rest, sir, but one low growl from the dog had ended the discussion. Now even the medics had learned to step around him. Daniel sat on a crate a few feet away, elbows on his knees, his hands raw and bleeding where the ice had torn through his gloves. The cuts burned in the warm air, but he barely felt them. His thoughts looped like a broken record, the crack, the scream, the empty water. Every time he blinked, he saw it again. He rubbed a hand over his face, muttering under his breath, "You almost lost her, you almost." Shadow's ear flicked. The dog lifted his head and looked at him with eyes that were too knowing, too calm. Daniel met the gaze and forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "Yeah, I know, boy. She's breathing. That's what matters." He dragged himself up and knelt beside them. Emily's small hand had slipped from under the blanket, resting on Shadow's neck. Her fingers twitched occasionally, curling deeper into the fur as if afraid he might leave. Daniel adjusted the blanket, tucking it closer. A medic came by quietly. "Her vitals are holding. Temperature's climbing. She's past the danger point." Daniel's shoulders sagged. "You sure?" The medic smiled faintly. "She'll need monitoring, but, yeah. You can breathe again." When the man left, Daniel did breathe, slow, deliberate, shaky. The sound felt foreign in his chest. He lowered himself to the cold floor beside the cot, his back against the wall. The adrenaline that had kept him upright drained out, leaving only exhaustion. For a long time, there was nothing but the rhythm of two heartbeats, the slow, steady thump of the child and the quiet, tireless drum of the dog. The storm outside had its own rhythm, softer now, like a lullaby for survivors. Daniel let his head tip back against the wall. "You saved her, Shadow," he whispered. "You didn't even think. You just jumped." The shepherd's tail brushed once against the floor, acknowledgement, nothing more. His eyes drooped but never closed completely. He was standing guard still. Daniel smiled weakly. "You know, they train us to fight, to shoot, to rescue. They never trained me for this part, the waiting." Hours bled together. At some point someone draped a blanket over Daniel's shoulders. He barely noticed. He watched frost melt down the windows, turning the panes into streaks of silver under the heater's glow. Outside, dawn threatened, a thin blue light creeping through cracks in the clouds. Emily stirred near sunrise. A soft whimper escaped her throat, muffled by the mask. Shadow's head shot up instantly. He gave a quiet bark, half warning, half joy. Daniel leaned forward. "Easy, kiddo, it's okay. You're safe." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then landing on the dark blur beside her. "Shadow," she breathed, voice hoarse but alive. The dog pressed his nose against her cheek, tail wagging weakly, a sound between a sigh and a whine escaping him. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat and brushed her hair back. "Yeah," he murmured. "He never left you." The heater hummed, the light brightened, and for the first time since the ice cracked, warmth truly reached them, not just the kind that thaws skin, but the kind that thaws fear. By the time the sun broke through the gray veil of clouds, Miller's Lake looked like an entirely different world. The night's fury had left behind a scene of breathtaking silence, snow glittering in the light, trees bowing beneath the weight of ice, the surface of the lake sealed again like a wound healed overnight. It was beautiful in a cruel way, as if the storm were pretending nothing had happened. Inside the firehouse, the heater's steady hum filled the stillness. Emily was awake now, barely, eyes half open, lips moving in faint murmurs under the oxygen mask. Her cheeks had a hint of color again. Shadow remained pressed to her side, refusing to budge even when medics tried to check her temperature. Every time a gloved hand reached too close, he lifted his head, ears tilted forward, body tense but silent, a living sentinel. Daniel watched them through a blur of fatigue. He hadn't slept since yesterday morning. The edges of his vision swam, his hands trembled from cold and adrenaline crashes, but his mind stayed locked on the two souls in front of him. Emily was alive. Shadow was breathing. That was all he needed. The door creaked open, a blast of icy air curling through the warmth. A woman's voice cut the quiet. "Daniel." He looked up sharply. Mira stood in the doorway, face pale, eyes red from hours of crying and praying. Snow still clung to her coat. The moment she saw the cot, her legs gave out and she half ran, half fell across the room. "Emily!" Her cry wasn't a word, it was a sound ripped straight from the heart. Daniel stepped back as she reached the cot. Emily blinked, recognition slowly cutting through the fog. "Mom," she whispered, barely audible beneath the mask. Mira clutched her daughter's hand and pressed it to her face, tears spilling freely. "Oh God, baby, I thought I lost you." Shadow shifted, watching the exchange. When Mira leaned closer, he gave a small warning whine, not aggressive, just protective. Daniel knelt beside him, hand on the dog's neck. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. "She's home now." The shepherd relaxed, head dropping back onto the blanket. His eyes half closed for the first time in hours. Daniel could feel the heat coming off his fur, he was exhausted, dehydrated, spent from the night's ordeal. Still, he refused to sleep fully, ears flicking with every soft sound Emily made. Mira looked up at Daniel, her voice shaking. "They told me she fell through the ice, that no one could find her. But you," her gaze fell to Shadow. "And him, you brought her back." Daniel swallowed, suddenly aware of how tired he was. "It wasn't me," he said quietly. "He found the spot. He never left it. He wouldn't even blink." Mira reached out a trembling hand and stroked Shadow's head. The dog leaned into her touch without opening his eyes. Tears glistened on Mira's fingers. "Then God sent him to us," she whispered. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to smile fully, not the tight, guarded kind from battlefields or briefings, but the honest, bone-deep kind that comes when you see a miracle and realize you were part of it. Emily's voice was tiny, fragile. "Shadow saved me, Mom. I heard him bark, under the water. I heard him." Mira blinked, tears falling again. "I know, baby." He never stopped. Daniel looked away, his own eyes burning. Outside, the sun broke free from the clouds, casting long lines of gold through the frosted windows. The light spilled over the cot, turning the steam from Shadow's fur into tiny ribbons of fire. The storm was over. A medic came by with fresh blankets and a soft smile. "She'll need rest, but she's out of danger now. You all should get some sleep too." "Sleep?" The word sounded foreign. Daniel glanced at Shadow, the dog already half asleep against Emily, and then back to Mira. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe now we can." Mira leaned her head down on the cot beside her daughter, still holding her hand. Daniel sank to the floor, resting his back against the same wall as last night. He closed his eyes but didn't sleep. He listened to the soft breaths, child, dog, mother, three fragile rhythms blending into one song of survival. For the first time since the ice broke, peace felt real. A week later, Miller's Lake lay silent again, smooth, white, unbroken. The surface had refrozen completely, thick and solid, reflecting the pale skylight glass. It was hard to believe that beneath all that calm, a child had almost vanished, that a storm had once screamed across this same place. Daniel stood at the edge of the frozen water, hands in his coat pockets, his breath curling in thin silver clouds. Shadow sat beside him, tail sweeping the snow slowly, eyes fixed on the lake's center. There was no fear in him now, only recognition. The shepherd's gaze was steady, almost reverent, like he knew exactly where the crack had been. Behind them, Emily's laughter carried softly through the cold air. She was bundled in layers of wool and scarves, walking carefully between the snowbanks as her mother followed close behind. The color had returned to her cheeks, her movements sure again. She looked smaller somehow, not because she'd changed, but because the memory of that night still made her seem fragile. When she spotted Daniel in shadow, she hurried over, boots crunching on the snow. "Can I go closer?" she asked, her voice tentative. Daniel nodded, offering his gloved hand. "Just stay on the edge. Ice is strong now, but we don't take chances anymore." She gripped his hand tightly and stepped forward beside Shadow. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the wind whispering through the pines. Then Emily pointed. "It was right there, wasn't it?" Daniel followed her gaze. The spot she indicated was unmarked now, just another patch of white in an endless field. But he could see it clearly, the circle of black water, the red scarf sinking, the dog barking until his throat was raw. "Yeah," he said softly. "Right there." Shadow took a few steps forward, sniffing the air, then the ground. His paw pressed against the ice once, gently, as if testing it. Then he looked back at Emily, tail wagging once before he sat down. Emily crouched beside him, fingers threading through his fur. "You found me," she whispered. "You didn't let me go." The shepherd pressed his head against her arm, closing his eyes. Daniel felt the lump rise in his throat again. There were moments on the battlefield that had seared into his mind, the sound of distant artillery, the weight of fallen brothers, but none had ever stayed with him like the image of Shadow lying beside that crack, refusing to move. Mira called softly from behind, "Emily, don't stay out too long. You'll catch cold." "I'm okay," the girl called back, her eyes still on Shadow. Daniel smiled faintly. "Your mom worries, you know." Emily looked up at him, her voice small but firm. "She said you and Shadow are heroes." Daniel chuckled quietly. "Shadow, maybe. I just followed his lead." Shadow's ears flicked at the sound of his name. Daniel knelt, running a hand over the dog's neck. "You hear that, buddy? They're talking about medals for dogs now." The shepherd licked his gloved hand once and looked back toward the lake, eyes distant. For a while, no one spoke. The sun broke free of the clouds, scattering light across the frozen expanse. It gleamed off the ice in shades of gold and silver, painting the snowdrifts with soft warmth. The world looked clean again, deceptively peaceful. Emily tugged at Daniel's sleeve. "Do you think the ice remembers?" He glanced down at her, unsure how to answer. "Maybe," he said finally. "Maybe it remembers the ones who survived it." Shadow stood, stretching before stepping closer to the lake's edge once more. His reflection shimmered faintly on the surface, dark fur against bright ice, strength against fragility. Daniel watched him and thought how strange it was that sometimes the bravest hearts didn't wear uniforms, or carry ranks, or speak in words. Sometimes they just waited, patient, loyal, and unyielding, beside a crack in the world. Emily knelt again, pressing her mittened hand to the ice. "Thank you," she whispered. The wind caught her words, scattering them across the lake. Shadow wagged his tail once, low and slow, as if he understood. Daniel took a deep breath, the kind that hurt and healed at the same time. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's head back before it gets dark." Emily stood, brushing snow from her coat. Shadow fell into step between her and Daniel as they turned toward the treeline, the three of them walking side by side. Behind them, the lake remained silent, calm, and whole, but for those who had seen beneath its surface, its memory would never fade. The ceremony was small, almost humble, but in Miller's Creek it felt like history. A week of sun had melted the top layer of snow, turning the ground to patches of dark earth and glistening puddles. Outside the rebuilt firehouse, a makeshift podium stood draped with the flag, and the townspeople gathered in thick coats and scarves. Children clutched their parents' hands, neighbors huddled together against the wind. They had all come for one reason, to see the shepherd who had refused to leave the ice. Shadow sat beside Daniel at the front, his black and tan coat brushed clean, a bright collar glinting in the pale light. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, tail still, ears alert, gaze fixed on the horizon instead of the crowd. Daniel stood straight, his own uniform pressed but worn, a reminder that heroes didn't always come from wars. Mayor Thompson stepped up to the microphone, clearing his throat. "We gather today not to honor rank or uniform, but courage," he began. His voice carried easily across the quiet crowd. "When a storm struck this town, and a child was taken by the ice, one soldier and one dog refused to give up. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't measure the odds. They simply went." Applause rippled, hesitant at first, then building. Daniel's face remained steady, but his jaw tightened, humility and memory twisting together. Shadow lifted his head slightly at the sound, tail giving a single sweep against the ground. The mayor gestured toward them. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves, and Shadow, the shepherd who showed this town what loyalty truly means, please step forward." Daniel guided Shadow up the small steps. The wooden boards creaked beneath his boots. As they reached the podium, the mayor leaned down and clipped a small medal to Shadow's collar, a simple brass disc engraved with one word, Guardian. The crowd erupted. Children cheered, cameras flashed. Shadow tilted his head, eyes wide and calm, then looked back at Daniel as if asking what all the noise was about. Daniel crouched beside him, one hand on his neck. "You earned it, buddy," he murmured. "Every breath she takes, that's your medal." When the ceremony ended, people lined up to shake his hand and pet the dog. Emily arrived last, walking shyly through the crowd with her red scarf wrapped twice around her neck. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. When she reached them, she knelt and pressed the flowers into Shadow's paws. "For you," she said. "They're not real medals, but Mom said heroes should get both." Shadow sniffed the flowers once, then licked her mitten. The girl giggled, and for Daniel that sound was worth more than every clap or camera flash. Later, after the crowd dispersed and twilight began to fall, Daniel led Shadow down to the lakeshore again. The ice was solid, gleaming under the dim sunset. The air smelled of pine and cold water. No ceremony, no speeches, just the soldier and his dog standing where everything had nearly ended. Daniel pulled off his gloves and crouched, tracing the ice with bare fingers. "You know," he said quietly, "I've seen men freeze in fear. I've seen some turn away when it mattered most. But you didn't even hesitate." He looked at Shadow's reflection on the ice, proud, calm, and unmovable. "I'll never forget that." The shepherd nudged his arm with a cold nose, tail brushing his side. Daniel smiled faintly. "From now on, anywhere I go, you go. That's my promise." They stood there until the first stars appeared. The wind was gentle now, whispering through the trees like the soft breathing of a sleeping world. Daniel looked across the lake, to the spot that had once been a hole in the world, and exhaled. He could almost hear Emily's laughter on the air, faint and distant. The sound mixed with the quiet jingle of Shadow's new metal as the shepherd turned toward home. Daniel followed, his boots crunching softly on the snow. Behind them, the lake lay peaceful, scarred once, healed now, its frozen surface reflecting a promise made between a man, a dog, and a life pulled back from darkness. The town slept soundly that night. For the first time in weeks, no wind howled through the pines, no storm clawed at the rooftops. The snow outside glowed faintly under the moonlight, smooth and untouched, as if the world itself wanted to give Miller's Creek a moment of silence. Inside Daniel's small cabin on the edge of the woods, the fireplace crackled softly, throwing warm amber light across the walls. Shadows danced over old photographs, a younger Daniel in uniform, a unit lined up in desert heat, faces dusty and proud. But tonight, the photo that mattered most wasn't on the wall. It was the one he had tucked into his pocket earlier that day, a picture the mayor's wife had taken at the ceremony, Emily hugging Shadow, the metal catching the light, Daniel kneeling beside them both. He took the picture out now and set it gently on the coffee table. The flames flickered against the glass, giving it life. Shadow lay stretched out on the rug in front of the fire, his body finally still. His fur gleamed in the firelight, brushed and clean for the first time since the rescue. His metal hung loose against his chest, the brass disc reflecting tiny sparks of light with every slow breath he took. Daniel watched him for a long time, elbows on his knees, a half-empty mug of coffee cooling in his hands. The exhaustion that had stalked him since that night still lingered, but it had changed form. It wasn't panic or fear anymore. It was something gentler, the kind of tiredness that comes after you've given everything you have and finally get to rest. He reached down and ran his hand through the dog's fur. "You earned this, Shadow. All of it." The shepherd stirred, eyes blinking open. He tilted his head toward Daniel and gave a low, contented groan, like an acknowledgement. His tail brushed once against the rug, slow, heavy, satisfied. Daniel smiled faintly. "You remember that first night we got called in together? They said you were too stubborn to train. Guess they were half right." Shadow let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a sigh. Daniel leaned back in his chair, gaze drifting toward the window. The lake was visible from here, a pale shimmer beyond the dark treeline. Even frozen, it looked alive, catching the faint light of the moon. He whispered softly, mostly to himself, "She's safe because of you." The words were simple, but they carried everything he couldn't say aloud, the fear, the relief, the silent gratitude. Outside, a faint crunch of footsteps broke the stillness. Daniel turned his head just in time to see a small figure approaching the porch, Emily, bundled in her red scarf, Mira following close behind. He opened the door before they could knock. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, smiling softly. Mira returned the smile. She insisted on seeing him. Said she forgot to say goodnight. Emily stepped forward, her breath forming little clouds in the cold air. "Can I?" she asked, pointing at Shadow. Daniel stepped aside. "Of course." The girl knelt beside the shepherd, resting her small hand on his back. "Hey, hero," she whispered. Shadow stirred, tail thumping weakly, muzzle pressing into her arm. "Mom says I should thank you every night." Daniel watched from the doorway, his heart heavy and full at once. Mira stood beside him quietly. "He hasn't left her side once since that day," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "He probably never will." For a few minutes, they all just stood there, the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Shadow's breathing filling the space. Emily rested her head on the dog's shoulder, eyelids drooping. Mira knelt and brushed her daughter's hair back. "Time to go, sweetheart." Emily looked up sleepily. "Can he come tomorrow?" Daniel chuckled. "He wouldn't forgive me if he didn't." As they stepped back outside, the cold air rushed in for a moment, sharp, clean, alive. Daniel watched them walk down the snowy path, the moonlight turning their footsteps silver. When he turned back inside, Shadow was already half asleep again, head resting on his paws. Daniel closed the door, fed another log into the fire, and lowered himself to the rug beside his partner. "Get some rest, buddy," he murmured. "You've earned more than a medal." Shadow's eyes flicked open one last time. He gave a small, content rumble, the kind that sounded like peace itself, then drifted off completely. Daniel leaned back against the wall, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the frozen world glittered in silence. Inside, for the first time in a long, long while, there was warmth that wasn't just from the fire, it was from knowing they had both come through the storm, and this time, everyone had made it home. The lake was different now. Not dangerous, not angry, just quiet. The same sun that had once glittered off shards of broken ice now shone warmly across an unbroken surface. The storm's scars were gone, but Daniel knew they were only hidden beneath the surface, like all the things men carry and never speak of. He walked slowly along the shoreline, boots crunching in the thin crust of snow. The morning was crisp, his breath rising in silver puffs. Behind him, Shadow padded in steady rhythm, his paw prints falling directly inside Daniel's, the way he always walked when the world was calm. Daniel stopped near the center of the frozen lake where it had all happened. The air was sharp here, the silence so complete that he could hear the faint creak of the ice beneath. A sound that should have felt ominous, but now it just sounded alive. He knelt down, brushing a glove across the frozen surface. "You remember this spot, don't you?" Shadow sat beside him, eyes fixed ahead. He didn't bark, didn't move. Only his breath fogged the air, slow and deliberate. The brass metal around his neck caught the light, throwing tiny reflections across the ice like sparks of gold. For a moment, Daniel just sat there in the stillness, the memories replaying on loop, the crack, the scream, the frantic radio call, the first glimpse of Emily's limp hand. He swallowed hard. Gratitude had a strange weight to it. Sometimes it pressed on your chest heavier than grief. The shepherd stood suddenly, nose twitching. His tail gave one quick sweep. Daniel frowned. "What is it?" Shadow took a few steps forward, paws crunching lightly, and stopped near a patch where the ice seemed thinner, not cracked, just faintly clouded. He lowered his head, sniffing, pawing once. Daniel followed. When he crouched beside the dog, he saw it, something faint and red just beneath the ice, caught in a layer of frozen clarity. He brushed snow away until the shape revealed itself, Emily's missing scarf, the one that had vanished that night. For a moment he didn't move. The scarf was tangled in the ice like a ribbon of memory, frozen, preserved, proof that some part of that night still lived here. He exhaled slowly, the sound trembling in the cold. "You found it again," he murmured. Shadow pressed his paw against the ice and gave a soft whine. It wasn't the sharp, fearful sound from that night. It was gentler, recognition, not alarm. Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah, I know. She doesn't need it anymore." He straightened, looking out over the vast, gleaming lake. The wind brushed his face, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow, clean, untouched. Behind him, sunlight struck the ice, scattering light in all directions. The reflection danced across Shadow's metal, the little word guardian glowing brighter than ever. "Funny thing," Daniel said softly. "You can fight through war, through loss, through everything the world throws at you. But sometimes it's the quiet moments that hit the hardest." Shadow moved closer, pressing his shoulder against Daniel's leg. The soldier rested his hand on the dog's back, letting the warmth of living fur remind him of everything that had survived. They stayed like that for a while, man and dog, two survivors staring at the same patch of ice where the world had almost ended. Finally, Daniel bent down again and spoke quietly to the frozen scarf. "You'll stay here, kiddo. Let the lake keep it. Some stories deserve to be remembered right where they happened." He stood, patting Shadow's neck. "Come on, partner. Time to head home. The shepherd hesitated just long enough to take one last look at the scarf, then turned, tail brushing Daniel's knee as they began to walk back to shore. Their shadows stretched long across the snow, two silhouettes moving in sync, fading into the pale morning light. At the edge of the trees, Daniel paused and glanced back one last time. The lake was glowing now, sunlight reflecting off the frozen surface, bright enough to sting his eyes. He smiled softly. "We made it through, didn't we?" Shadow looked up at him, amber eyes shining, and gave a single bark, deep, solid, final. Daniel laughed under his breath. "Yeah, we did." As they disappeared into the forest trail, the lake fell silent again. But beneath that silence, beneath the frozen surface, something lingered, an echo of a bark, the faint ripple of a scarf beneath the ice, and the memory of a promise that would never melt. By late March, the ice began to crack for the last time, not from weight or struggle, but from spring itself. The world was thawing. The lake that had once swallowed a child was waking up again, rippling with the sound of melting water. Every morning, the air smelled different, wet earth, pine, and something alive. Daniel walked the path down to Miller's Lake the way some people visit graves, quietly, reverently, as if approaching sacred ground. Shadow padded alongside him, tail swaying lazily, his metal glinting in the sunlight with every step. The snow had retreated into the forest edges, revealing soft mud and new shoots of grass. The world had begun again. When they reached the waterline, Daniel stopped. Where once there had been nothing but ice and silence, now there was movement, tiny ripples spreading out from the shore, sunlight shattering across the surface like gold dust. He stood there for a while, just listening, birds calling, the gentle lap of water, the whisper of wind through pines. Every sound felt like a heartbeat, proof that the season had finally changed. Shadow stepped forward, paws sinking into the damp earth. He sniffed the air, then the ground, circling slowly before sitting down, gaze fixed on the lake's center. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just watched. It was as if he could still see the ghost of that crack, the spot where life had nearly stopped. Daniel crouched beside him. "You remember everything, don't you?" The shepherd turned his head slightly, amber eyes soft. Daniel smiled. "Yeah. Me too." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of fabric sealed inside a clear plastic pouch. Emily's scarf. He'd returned a few days after finding it frozen under the ice and chipped it free carefully, almost afraid it might crumble. He'd kept it since then, a reminder not of the fear, but of what survived it. He placed the pouch down on a smooth stone near the shore. "Thought it belonged here," he said quietly. "Right where it all began." The wind stirred, carrying a faint echo of water moving under ice, like a sigh from the lake itself. Shadow leaned forward, sniffing the pouch once before settling again, tail brushing Daniel's boot. Daniel looked out across the thawing expanse. "You know, Shadow, people call what you did instinct. I've been in enough fights to know better. Instinct saves yourself. What you did, that was something else." He paused, his voice lowering. "That was love." The shepherd tilted his head, ears perked at the word, and gave a soft huff, almost like an answer. Daniel chuckled under his breath. "Didn't think I'd ever use that word again. Guess you brought it back." They sat there together for a long while, watching the ice break and drift away in slow, graceful sheets. Each piece that floated off seemed to carry a memory, the roar of the storm, the glow of the firehouse heater, Emily's first breath after silence. Now, all of it was dissolving into the water, not erased, just changed. Eventually, Daniel stood, brushing snowmelt from his hands. "Come on, partner. Let's head home." But Shadow didn't move. He was staring at something near the edge of the water, a shape half buried in the melting snow. Daniel followed his gaze and crouched down. It was a small wooden toy boat, worn and water-stained, the kind a child might have set adrift months ago. He picked it up carefully, turning it in his hands. Emily's initials were carved into the side. Daniel smiled, a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh escaping him. Looks like the lake decided to give something back. He tucked the boat into his coat and finally turned toward the path. Shadow followed this time, glancing back only once before trotting to Daniel's side. Their footprints sank side by side into the wet soil, filling slowly with water as they went, temporary marks, fading almost as soon as they were made. At the top of the hill, Daniel stopped for one last look. The lake shimmered beneath the sun, no longer a place of fear but of memory, a mirror of everything that had been lost and found again. The shepherd stood beside him, chest out, wind rippling through his fur, metal glinting bright. Daniel reached down and ruffled his neck gently. "Come on, guardian. Let's go home." Shadow barked once, short, clear, certain, and together they turned toward the forest trail. Behind them, the ice cracked one final time, a soft sound that echoed across the water like a farewell. The wind carried it away, blending it with the rustle of pines and the distant sound of a child's laughter, faint, but real. Winter had ended. And for the soldier and his dog, the world felt alive again.